Very well. So please, you can have the floor and feel free to share your slides if you have any to share.
Okay, many thanks, Clément. And thank you to you, Clément, and Orsolia for inviting us, giving us this opportunity to speak to your network and to share with you, at least briefly, our ideas from the book, The Costs of Connection, and its core concept of data colonialism. And we want to think with you today about the implications of this concept for current policy about data, platforms, and AI. Now, the question that we pose in the book is basically very, very simple. What is going on with data? How should we frame the new, the not so new developments with data in business and government, in society and the economy, in daily life for each of us? Developments that for sure have been accelerated by the living conditions of the global pandemic, which still, of course, continues. There are many ideas on the table about how to make sense of what's going on with data. Almost all of them until now explain what's going on with data as something to do with capitalism, as a new form of capitalism, digital capitalism, informational capitalism, platform capitalism, most famously surveillance capitalism, and also data capitalism. But in our book, we want to ask, is there something potentially even larger going on, something truly momentous in world history, which will be a new phase, a new stage in the relations between colonialism and capitalism? We get a hint of this, that something colonial might be involved here from business cliches of the past 5 years. For example, the famous cover of The Economist magazine from May 2017, "Data is the new oil." Now, is this just a harmless metaphor? Or is this phrase precisely the apparently harmless cover that disguises a new reality that really does merit the name colonialism?
So a central point in our argument is that we are actually not using the word colonialism metaphorically. We are being very intentional and careful about its use, but we're not using allegorically, we're using it to describe, in fact, an emergent reality, a new phase of colonialism that we are obviously calling data colonialism. And we are arguing that this new phase prepares the ground for a new mode of capitalist production, much in a similar way as what happened when in colonialism, the wealth generated through the plantations and through the mines financed the factories that would give rise to industrial capitalism. All of this, of course, is happening while this new phase of colonialism coexists with the legacy of neocolonial violence that, of course, targets historically at-risk populations in terms of race, in terms of class, gender, and, of course, environmental destruction as well. Now, one of the questions we are asking is whether we can, in fact, expect to see, for instance, the same scale of violence that we saw with the original phase of colonialism. And we are saying that not necessarily. We're not making a one-to-one comparison, but we are saying that the functions, in fact, might be similar. Let me at this point sort of give you the official definition of data colonialism as Nick and I proposed it in our book. We say that data colonialism is an emerging order for the appropriation of human life so that data can be continuously extracted from it for profit. So we're not saying that all data is bad and we're not against data. If you consult the weather report today, that's in fact a form of using data. So we're being very specific about this definition. We are arguing that in order to understand this definition, we perhaps need to understand the difference between colonialism and coloniality, as the sociologist Aníbal Quijano defined it. And basically his point was that the legacy of colonialism continues, even though colonies got their independence and colonialism is over per se. So we are saying that when we're making this comparison, there are, of course, important differences. differences in terms of the modes, the intensities, the scales, the context of colonialism. The old colonialism and the new one are very different. But we are saying that there is one key similarity, and that is the historical function of both kinds of colonialism are the same, and that function is to extract, to dispossess. Now, how is this new social order being rationalized? We argue that one of the reasons it's very effective is because the new rationalities are based on the old rationalities, have very deep colonial roots. And one way to explain these is to start, for instance, with the concept of cheap nature. Now, in order to colonize the world, the colonizer had to define or describe nature as something cheap. It was supposed to be abundant, it was supposed to be free, just there for the taking. From a judicial or juridical perspective, it was supposed to be ownerless, at least a civilized owner. Of course, those lands were inhabited, but those inhabitants were said to not be civilized. So we have the concept of terra nullius, which basically means no man's land, which allowed the colonizer to appropriate this land. From cheap nature, we can follow the progression to cheap labor. And again, in colonialism, this concept implied that some human beings, and this was mostly determined by race, as we know, were intended to provide the necessary labor to transform nature into wealth. So in this way, exploitation and abuse were framed as social progress, as something good for humanity. So if we follow this progression from cheap nature to cheap labor, now we, of course, have cheap data. And if you notice, cheap data has many of the same characteristics that cheap nature and cheap labor have. Cheap data is said to be abundant. It's said to be free, just there for the taking. It doesn't have an owner. Yes, you and I might produce it individually, but by the time it gets aggregated, it requires advanced technology that only big corporations have, much like oil, which needed to be refined to be turned into something useful. Mm-hmm. So in this way, we begin to realize that the extractive relations are connected through these various social spheres.
Now, we realize that it may seem unsettling to compare what's going on with data in both global South and global North to colonialism. So let's try and summarize here what we see as the key advantages of this provocative move. And the advantages are really of two types. There are advantages of scope and advantages of depth. So first of all, a decolonial approach to data means understanding it in terms of not just the past 40 years, in which, of course, the internet has emerged as a basic feature of daily life, but understanding it in terms of the past 500 years, the 500 years of colonialism. And it also means looking further into the future, seeing what's happening today with data as both a new historical form of resource abstraction that builds the foundations for the next stage of capitalism, just as historical colonialism laid the foundations centuries later for the emergence of industrial capitalism. A decolonial approach to data also widens our sense of the scope of what's going on through data. So what's happening with data that we're interested in the book is not just about the obvious targets of social media, though they're important. It's also about the massive widening of surveillance of all sorts of people, particularly workers across economies. It's about the emergence of new types of economic power in the so-called gig economy through the power of gathering and monitoring data on platforms. It's about the massive expansion of logistics in the past 3 or 4 decades, which, of course, yes, it does involve tracking objects, and we all like our packages to arrive on time, but it also inevitably involves at the very same time tracking workers, yet again, ever more intensively. And finally, and most neglected of all, but just as much part of data colonialism, is the huge rise of internal corporate data. It's striking that IBM, not one of the most notable big tech companies, But IBM in its 2016 annual report said that 80% of the world's most valuable data is internal to corporations, which is interesting because that very definition of what data is internal to a corporation is itself being massively expanded. Think of a smart fridge. If you have one, then your private movements of taking milk in and out of your fridge every morning now are internal to the corporation which provided the smart fridge. So those are advantages of scope, but a decolonial approach to data also has an advantage of depth. It deepens our sense of what is being done through data. And we argue in the book, it's the creation of a new social order, just as historical colonialism created completely new types of social order, new forms of dependency, new forms of rule and governance, based on, of course, apparently nice things, convenience, customization, but also based on new forms of force, always reinforcing those older inequalities inherited from the earlier histories of colonialism and capitalism, inequalities of class, gender, and race. And finally, a decolonial approach to data helps us see what is perhaps the deepest continuity of all with colonialism, to see big data and artificial intelligence as not simply an objective science that stands above social reality and power relations, but as itself the continuation both of the colonial practices of population surveillance, but even at its deepest level, the continuation of the West's long-term attempt to impose one single version of rationality onto the world in the interest of the power of the West. This is what Quijano calls the coloniality of knowledge. But at the same time, all of this is happening within the highly unequal legacy of colonialism, historical colonialism, as Bhattacharya points out in her theory of racial capitalism. Okay, that's the theoretical overview of the concept of data colonialism, and it is complicated. But in one sense, data colonialism is very simple in practical terms, because every time we accept an app on our phone, every time we join a new digital platform, every time we introduce a smart device that's going to collect data in our home, every time we do that, we fall back into the spiral of what in our book we call data relations. And we usually do this falling back into data relations quite peacefully, without resistance. But this raises an interesting and crucial question, which you may yourself have been asking us if you listen to us, because where is the violence of this new type of colonialism? Isn't the absence of brutal physical violence the big difference from historical colonialism? But the question is how we explain this. The explanation why physical violence is not absolutely necessary anymore for the new stage of data colonialism is very important. Remember that historical colonialism, in that context, it happened when there were absolutely no prior social relations between the colonizers and the colonized, which meant there were only two ways of grabbing the gold: brutal physical violence and deception. And of course, the colonizers usually use both. But today's data colonialism, inevitably, because it's happening 500 years on in history, happens against the background of at least 2 centuries of human beings becoming trained in capitalism's social relations. And that means that today, just a small change to the legal terms that govern the operation of our phones is enough to fundamentally change our relations to the flow of our lives.
Let's talk more specifically about the coloniality of these data relations that Nick was just mentioning. And in the book, what we do is we conduct various transhistorical comparisons using the past to understand the coloniality of data relations in the present. And we organize these comparisons using the same 4X game model found in strategy video games. So when you play a strategy video game, you apply 4 strategies, the 4X strategies, which are explore, expand, exploit, and exterminate. These are very similar to the strategies colonizers applied, and which you also use when you play video games, such as the one you see in the background here, which is part of Sid Meier's Civilization series. Now, we don't have time to do a review of all of these strategies, so let's just focus on two. Let's start with explore. And what I want to do here is just compare two documents. The first one, which you see here, is part of Google Terms of Service for installing Chrome, their web browser. And in case you, like most of us, haven't read them, here is what those Terms of Service say. You give Google a perpetual, irrevocable, worldwide, royalty-free, and non-exclusive license to reproduce, adapt, modify, translate, publish, publicly perform, publicly display, and distribute any content which you submit, post, or display on or through the services. In other words, when we install Google Chrome, we are surrendering a lot of rights, as you can see here. Now, I want to compare this document to a much older one called the requerimiento, the requirement, or the demand in Spanish. And this was a document read by Spanish conquistadors as they were arriving and preparing to colonize a village or a city in the New World. They would oftentimes arrive in the middle of the night under cover of darkness, and they would stand outside the city limits and proceed to read this document in Spanish to a population, obviously, that could not understand Spanish. And the document said, in part, but if you do not submit to Spanish rule, that is, I certify to you that with the help of God, we shall powerfully enter into your country and shall make war against you in all ways and manners that we can, and shall subject you to the yoke and obedience of the church and of their highnesses. We shall take you and your wives and your children and shall make slaves of them, and as such shall sell and dispose of them as their highnesses may command. And we shall take away your goods and shall do all the mischief and damage that we can. That's the Spanish Requerimiento 1513. Please click accept and install over there. Now, we're not saying here that what happened after the Requerimiento was read is the same thing that happens after we install Google Chrome. Fortunately, Google's not going to come over and take away our wives and our children. But we are calling attention to the use of this misleading and abstract language to conduct the initial trick, as we might call it, of dispossession. As a way to talk about the expansion, here's where we want to start talking about data sovereignty a little bit. And perhaps frame sovereignty also as a tool of colonial expansion. Now, this stuff, I'm assuming you already know, the basic definition of sovereignty as the authority or the autonomy, the power to act. And this power can be used by an individual or perhaps through a social construct such as a territory or a state, nation. But it's important to remember that this concept also has colonial roots, or at least colonial applications. Sovereignty can be seen as an instrument for colony formation and even colony independence, as was used in many instances, including in the formation of the United States. So colonies had the power to define themselves as sovereign and independent in relation to the motherland. Today, of course, digital manifestations of sovereignty revolve mostly around the protection of the homeland in some ways. So digital sovereignty allows states to localize control over national data and to perhaps promote national industries and innovation, vis-a-vis the influence, of course, mainly of Silicon Valley on the one hand, and the Chinese Communist Party on the other. Now, what is interesting is that both autocratic and democratic manifestations of digital sovereignty use the same tools, the same surveillance technologies, or the same, perhaps, industry incentives that benefit specific groups. This is concerning because it suggests that once the infrastructure is in place, it can serve either agenda, autocratic or democratic. Which is why we think we need to ask, when claims of sovereignty are issued, on whose behalf is sovereignty declared? Who is the we in these declarations of sovereignty? And are the benefits and costs of sovereignty evenly distributed? Most often, as we know, they're not. So again, as we can see in the formation of the United States. So these questions are, of course, important to keep in mind.
So those are the complexities of some national responses to aspects of data colonialism. What about the recent international response of for example, the European Commission? Now, there are many, such as Shoshana Zuboff, who think that the proposed EU legislation is a decisive and comprehensive response to the problems of platform capitalism and platform power. But if we bear in mind that, as we argue, data colonialism is an emerging social order, it's not just a few unconnected practices by particular corporations, then we're not so convinced that this legislation is as comprehensive as it might seem. So let me go through a few points here, and you'll see from the small size of the font that we have to use, there's an awful lot we could say on this topic. If we start, though, with the GDPR, as you know, it was based on basically a consent regime, but has been developed in many critiques of the GDPR. That consent regime does not work so well when, as in reality, there is an unequal power landscape between corporations and those whose consent is being asked for. If we then move on to the more recent legislation, the boldest is, of course, the Digital Services Act. But let's think about what's not in the Digital Services Act. First of all, there is no prescription, there is no rule preventing specific harmful types of data collection. All the focus is on the impacts of data being used on the platforms. The focus is on moderation, explicit social harms, which arguably misses where a lot of the key harms operate, which is through the very act of harvesting data. Which takes us to an underlying point, that at no point in the Digital Services Act does the EU propose regulating the business models that are actually driving the data extraction, including the harmful data extraction, Instagram, and the extraction of data from young people in relation to messages that they might not want to have harvested, or in relation to them might be one example. But there's no regulation of those business models. There are also major exceptions to the regulation in the Act for the micro platforms, which mean that their business models, again, and their actions are never investigated under the terms of the Digital Services Act. Elsewhere in the new legislation, we see what is very much a pro-market vision, a sort of trickle-up vision that actually we don't think is plausible. So in the Digital Markets Act, for example, it's made quite explicit in the recitals to the Act that there will be no prohibition on, for example, deep consumer profiling as performed by advertisers. And there is the explicit hope that market competition, which is the core purpose of the Act, will naturally improve standards. So that's a belief that markets will solve everything. In fact, the emphasis is on opening up the flow of data right across to all businesses rather than limiting data collection. And that implies that there are no limits on data collection by small businesses. All the emphasis is on constraining the role of big tech and the way they distort markets in the flow of data. But you could argue that in an age of distributed power, this seems rather an inadequate way of dealing with corporate power in relation to data. Finally, and briefly, the Data Act and the Data Governance Act, they only regulate non-personal data, assuming that the GDPR deals elsewhere with personal data. But as we know, there isn't such a sharp division between non-personal and personal data. And if that division is blurred, and non-personal data also carries its risks, but is not constrained in how it's collected by the European legislation, then we could have a crucial gap. And again, as we said, even these acts do not restrict the extraction of data. In other words, the mistake we believe in the new legislation is to submit to the cliche that the only problem with data is how it's used, not how it's collected in the first place. But that is exactly to miss the extractive reality of data colonialism. So let's now turn briefly to resistance. how can we even begin to think about challenging and resisting something as large as data colonialism, something as large as a whole new social order of data extraction? Well, first of all, since data colonialism is a social economic order based on extracting data, one-track approaches, which are so common, will never work. Second, it's important to recognize that regulation has to go much deeper than it has done historically. I've just been making that point. It has to challenge the business models which drive the data extraction in the first place. And thirdly, although some of the implications of data colonialism are very general in nature, we have to recognize that the impacts they have on particular people are very unevenly distributed because of the continuing legacy of the inequality of historic colonialism. And I've just listed some writers who emphasize that. In other words, data colonialism is a very unequal order of inequality that requires many different forms of resistance.
And just to conclude, a couple more points on how we can resist. We have started to think about organizing this resistance in terms of working within, without, and against the status quo, much like activists in Latin America, for instance, have been doing for decades. So working within might mean working within traditional politics, in other words, electing leaders and promoting agendas that support our rights. Working without might mean certain forms of radical autonomy and solidarity, and all the way to working against, which might mean active forms of resistance and disobedience. Here, we would like to point out that we can learn a lot from past and present decolonization struggles, because there have always been people resisting colonialism. And while their struggles might be very different from ours, and we have to recognize in what ways we contribute to the systems that oppress these people, we can learn from these struggles as well. Mostly by using a very powerful tool in the fight against colonialism, and that is imagination. Because when colonialism couldn't be resisted with the body, it could always be resisted with the mind. So we see the process of decolonizing data as a creative process. That is why we must resist it with our minds, because it is above all an exercise in creativity, imagining collectively what disconnection looks like and what new forms of connection might look like. Thank you very much. Not to turn this into a promotion, but we've also included some codes for getting a discount for our book. We will post this in the chat as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the excellent presentation and the quite exceptional tour de force of presenting the core argument of your book, discussing the existing scholarship, reflecting on the EU digital current agenda, and also linking your research to potential avenues for the future. I have a lot of questions already, and if the attendees in the room have some, please add them in the Q&A box. And in the meantime, we will hear Julia Paul for the discussion of this presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Hello from my side as well. Thanks for the occasion to discuss this very impressive work. I basically have two comments. It's more kind of a reflection that I have when I was reading on your work and reading on data colonialism in general, and now also listening to your presentation. And the first point that I have concerns the relationship between colonialism and sovereignty. And I think you made it clear, you had a slide on it, I mean, how deeply entangled these two concepts are. But I thought what is interesting is how we in Europe, and now I'm speaking really like both my comments are from a very European perspective, so how we in Europe are currently using the concept of sovereignty when we speak about digital sovereignty or data sovereignty. Because we don't use it necessarily to refer to a state kind of level or a state dimension, not only to a collective level, but we also use it to refer to an individual level. So the kind of self-determination of citizens, of users of technology. So we refer to the kind of individual capacity of self-determination, if you want so. And this really means a move away from a state-centered understanding of sovereignty, which was underlying kind of all the colonial and decolonial movements, And so I was wondering if we do this move in kind of digital sovereignty discourses to move from the collective level to the individual one, and we kind of unconsciously also moving away from addressing the real issues that we try to solve with this quest for digital sovereignty. So namely the kind of the structural imbalances stemming from centuries of colonialism and capitalism. So the focus on the individual and its empowerment kind of avoids to focus on the collective and the structure that reproduces collective oppression. So it's a move that we saw also in the 1980s after the New Aligned movement also tried to kind of push for a new world information and communication order, and which then by the industrial world, by the global West, the global North, was kind of tried to overcome by shifting the focus from kind of these collective structures of inequality to the individual and its empowerment in kind of initiatives we all know about communication and technology for development. So then we already saw this move. And so I now, when I listened to you, I kind of thought, maybe we're doing exactly the same thing again with digital sovereignty. And maybe the risk that we conflate the individual and the collective dimension of sovereignty. I always thought it's the risk that we have is kind of getting an incoherent policy initiative, but maybe the risks of this conflation are even bigger and much more structural. So that was my first point. And the second point is kind of also going into the direction, because that refers to the question you raised about if European legislation might have an answer. And I thought this is, especially in light of the colonial history of Europe and European countries, is a very interesting one. And I'm sure you already heard this question many times. It's kind of an even paradoxical one, because Europe and some European countries like France over the last kind of years, they were really able more or less to push a discourse in which they are the victims of data extraction practices and kind of on the weak end of all these exploitative relations in the platform economy. And this concerns kind of the wish to change these relationships and become a sovereign and self-determined actor who's able to act and make decisions independently in the digital realm is kind of the key driver of European digital sovereignty discourses and initiatives. So Europe kind of tries to find a third way, which is different from the US way, which is different from the Chinese way. It's a better way, it's a value-based way, it's a democratic, human-centered way. It's simply the best path for digital future. So that's kind of the framing of this discourse. And this is clearly a reminder of colonial thinking. So the origins of coloniality is really that Europe imagined itself as the legitimate center which holds the ultimate truth, and only like, it's the kind of holds the best way of thinking and knowing and being. So this is at the heart of colonialism. So I wonder actually if this kind of way of framing European digital sovereignty discourses or data sovereignty discourses of creating this new European third way, which is the best way to go, and which is value-based and human-centered, isn't kind of not the repetition of what we had at the basis of colonialism. And doesn't it mean that while we phrase it this way, we don't also again avoid to think how Europe is also at the basis of this century-long standing history of inequalities. So that was kind of the reflection I had when I was listening to you as well. And these are my 2 points. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julia. Maybe Nick and Ulysses, if you want to answer them, and then please, all the attendees, feel free to add your question in the Q&A box. Otherwise, I will have questions, obviously.
Ulysses, shall I start with the second one on the EU legislation? I think, thank you very much, Julia. I think that's a very good point, and I haven't heard anyone make that point explicitly yet, but I think it's really important. And I think I have read through all the European legislation for a group I'm part of, and we're writing a piece about it now. But I think there's a real paradox that GDPR was without doubt an ideological challenge to neoliberal rhetoric, because it says in its first sentence that the collection of personal data raises fundamental problems of human rights. It's a change of discourse. That was a dramatic intervention and potentially a very positive one. Although, going back to your first question, entirely at the individual level, which is a problem with GDPR. But the basic idea of interrupting market discourse was a strong one. But what we then see through the public statements of the commissioners and then all the introductions to the new legislation is a sudden switch, but actually, as you say, maybe it's not so sudden. It was always intended from the beginning to say, well, actually, our main goal is to ensure that we don't get in the way of the flowing of data between corporations. Because we've dealt with the personal problem with the GDPR. So let's let the corporations do their bit. But the problem is the big tech corporations have too much power. They're getting in the way of the small corporations. And this is like speaking with a forked tongue, as we say. It's directly contradictory because it's obvious what you want to do if you want to be a data colonialist in Europe today. You set up a lot of small corporations and you make sure that none of your corporations has more than 85 million customers in the EU area. 84 million is okay, but not 85 million. So you're not subject to the social responsibilities of the Digital Markets Act. This is a green light to a sort of freewheeling, pioneering role of the data colonialist. And I think if you actually look very closely at one of the recitals to the GDPR, or actually the very first provision in the main part of the GDPR, it actually says, and a colleague of mine found this the other day, nothing in this legislation will prevent or help the free flow of data. In other words, it was always pro-data from the beginning. It was just appearing to be otherwise, which is quite revealing. So I think you really hit the nail on the head. This is very complicit with data colonialism. I completely agree.
Yeah, I guess I would just add, thank you, Julia, for framing your response in that very productive way. And I agree as far as your second point that there is a certain irony, at least standing from where I'm standing, to seeing former colonizers, declare themselves victims of this new order. And while in the book, we do try to make the point very carefully that while we might all be implicated in this new system of data colonialism, we are not just passive victims. We do play a very complicit and participatory role in this system. But still, I think it's interesting to see former colonizers claim the role of victims. And that's why I think it's important to ask this question of who is the we when we make certain claims about digital sovereignty, because are we, again, repeating the process of leaving out certain minorities who are perhaps subject to certain types of surveillance in this new economic data order? Are we perhaps erasing the environmental costs that these kinds of sovereignty carry? So I think these are very important questions. And to go back to your first point, this risky, as you point out, conflation of the individual and the collective, I think is something we need to pay attention to. It sort of reminded me of how, at least in the United States, I'm not so familiar with Europe, there were all of these proposals for solving this problem by paying individuals for their data. I think we saw perhaps Jaron Lanier make certain calls. So yes, this new extractivism is bad, but the way we can easily solve it is just to pay individuals for their data, which I even wrote an op-ed for Al Jazeera, sort of calling for the nationalization of data, because I think this approach to just seeing it from the perspective of the individual is very neoliberal and very limiting. Now, of course, to approach it from the perspective of the state carries other problems. I'm not saying that nationalization is a magic solution, but it's interesting to see that when we approach it from the perspective of the individual only, I think the scope of what we can do is very limited as well.